welcome to the first episode of the Gorgeous Gourds project. In this project, we are going to be drawing out gourds using a lot of line drawing techniques, a lot of shading techniques, and in this episode, I'm going to be introducing the basics of those things. So we're going to start out by doing a couple of practices, and I'm going to be leading you through how to complete these value scales. I'll go through very specifically and talk about what you should and shouldn't be doing to receive a good grade for this portion of your project. So let's begin. So let's talk about the supplies that you're going to receive. Each table will have a box of pencils and blending stumps, and each student should have these three things to themselves. So they should have a blending stump, they should have a 6B pencil, and they should have an HB pencil. You'll also have erasers and sharpeners to share for the table. So when you're working on a value scale, it's important to understand the difference between these pencils. So when you're working on darker values, I would recommend working with the 6B compared to working with medium tones and lighter tones, which would be the HB. And for your very lightest colors, you're going to work exclusively with the blending stump. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the value that is marked as number 10, and you'll notice that it goes all the way down to 0. So we want to make sure that all of our values are separate and very clearly different from each other. So we're going to start with our 6B at number 10, and I'm going to just use my pencil to kind of outline the edges first. And I'm going to work with small circular motions. Now the 10 is an easy one to start with because you can just press as hard as you can, of course without breaking your pencil. But you're going to fill this in using small circular motions and just looking to make sure that you don't leave any open areas that are maybe a little bit lighter than the rest of your drawing. When you're done working with the value number 10, you should be able to see a little bit of a shine. That means that this is what's called varnished and is your darkest value. So if you lift up your paper and you don't see that reflection coming off of your pencil because you've pressed so hard, that means that you need to go back through and add another layer because this should be our absolutely darkest value. Next, we're going to be working on value number 9, and we're going to complete it in the same way, but we're going to start by pressing just a little bit lighter. And so I'm really paying attention to the fact that I'm not pressing as hard. And as I'm going through, I'm still working with small circular motions. I'm avoiding using lines going across because then that does leave the impression of those lines. And I'm also going a little bit lighter than I think I'm going to need to. And the reason why is because I can always add another layer on top of it, but to make it lighter, if I went too dark, I would have to erase the entire thing and start over. So it's better to start out by adding a lighter layer, knowing that we can go back over it, rather than starting out too dark and having to erase it. Now, when you look at my value number 9, you can see that it's got what are called some blemishes, which means that these areas are just a little bit darker and these areas are a little bit lighter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first make sure that my pencil is sharp, because oftentimes what happens there is that your pencil is not able to just fill in all of those little grooves in your piece of paper. So I'm going to go back over the top and fill in any of these sections that turned out a little bit lighter so that it's a nice even tone. And I'm really looking at this picture next to me to make sure that I'm not getting too light too quickly. So I'm just going through and filling in some of these lighter patches to make sure that I have a nice smooth transition and I don't have any blemishes and that my value matches what is next to me. Now I'm working on value number 8 and I'm starting out the exact same way, but again, I'm going to start out a bit lighter than I think I'm going to need to. I've double check to make sure that my pencil is still nice and sharp, and I'm pressing lighter with my pressure on my pencil. So I'm not pressing as hard on the paper with my pencil to make sure that I'm adjusting the value. Oftentimes students will just continue to press with the same amount of pressure and their value doesn't change. So the way that you make your value look lighter is by using less pressure. So I'm using small circular motions and I'm trying to make sure that I'm avoiding blemishes, so I can see that there's like kind of a darker patch here. So I'm going back through, kind of adding some value around that. And I'm just continuing to fill this box, making sure it matches the values, making sure I don't have blemishes, making sure that I have a nice smooth texture. So the top 3 values that you have completed are going to be done with the 6B pencil because this has a softer lead, which means that more of the lead will come off on the paper, making it darker. When we're working on values 7 through 5, we're going to be working with our HB pencil. So this lead is a little bit harder, which means that less of it will be removed on the paper when we're applying pressure. So we're going to start out in the same way, and you'll notice that these lines are maybe a little bit finer or skinnier. We are going to apply less pressure with this pencil because it has a finer line and we don't want to end up with any texture marks. So we're just going through and trying our best to make it so that we don't have any blemishes that are showing up. And I notice I am going a little bit lighter than I probably need to, so I can probably go back through and add another layer, but it's always better to start out lighter than you think you'll need to, because you can adjust it much easier than if you start out too dark. So I'm just going to go through using small circular motions, working with my HB pencil for my 7th value. For the 6th value, I'm going to start in the exact same way. I'm just starting to press a little bit lighter with my pencil. So at this point, I'm really not applying very much pressure at all. And I'm just going through making my small circular motions so that you don't see my actual pencil lines, and trying to adjust my pressure so that I'm not going a little bit too dark, because that's much harder to fix than if you go too light. The last value that I'm going to complete with my HB pencil is number 5, which is considered our medium tone. So I'm going to go through again, starting the exact same way, but just pressing a little bit lighter. So I'm pressing lighter with my pencil, using those circular motions, going through and trying to match the value that is next to this. So again, I see I'm starting a little bit light, so I can go over and add another layer. It's always better to start off lighter than it is to start off too dark. So now I wanted to show you a close-up of what my values look like at this stage. So I've got my darkest varnished area of 10, and then a slow progression of change. And you'll notice that it is not very drastic at all. So it's just very subtle, but each box is slightly lighter than the one ahead of it. And you can see that the values match pretty closely to the box that is directly next to it. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through with my blending stump, and I'm going to start at my lightest tone, so my number 5, and I'm going to go through and blend each box separately. If I try to blend all of these at the same time, so if I'm like going back through and like going vertically, it's going to smear them all together to make them pretty close to the exact same value. So I really want to focus on making each step a separate value. So I'm going to go through starting at number 5, and I am using a blending stump, and something that's really important to begin with is cleaning your blending stump off. So some of them may have more on them than others, but you just need to kind of twist it on the side of your piece of paper to remove any excess. Now I'm going to start just down here, and I'm pressing very lightly, just barely touching the paper with my blending stump. And what my goal is here is first to match the tones. So if I notice that I'm starting to get too dark, that means that I need to press even lighter. And my second goal is to make sure that I'm getting rid of the texture that I created when I was working with my pencil. So I'm trying my hardest to make this as smooth as possible, getting rid of all of that pencil texture, and I'm trying to match the value that is directly next to it. So once I've done my lightest value, I'm just going to work my way backwards, continuing those same goals, matching the values exactly, and making this as smooth as possible. You'll notice that working with the blending stump is pretty similar to working with a pencil in the way that if you press harder, it will make it darker. So if you are trying to make a value just a little bit darker, you can apply a bit more pressure and smudge these areas together to make it a little darker. So now that I've gone through with my blending stump, you can notice that all of the texture has been removed and that the values are pretty close to matching the values that are directly next to them. So because we have gone through and blended these together and made sure that the values are first separate and second of all matching, third of all smooth, we're going to take our blending stump, specifically the end that we were just working with, and we're going to use that blending stump to fill in the remainder of our values. So you'll notice that if you take this and just use it off to the side, you can kind of test to see how much graphite is collected on your blending stump. Because when you go through and blend with the darker colors, you're essentially loading this up. It's almost like working with a paintbrush and like dipping your paintbrush into paint. So now I've collected graphite on the end of my blending stump, and I'm going to use that for my values 4 through 1. So I'm going to take this blending stump and I'm going to use it in the same way I've been using my pencil, starting out lighter than I think I'll need to, trying to match the color that's directly next to it, and working in small circular motions to avoid any lines or streaks. You may notice that at some point it will start to get lighter, and that means that you need to essentially load your paintbrush again. So one easy way to do that is to go up to value number 10. Because you varnished so much there, you should have a pretty good collection of graphite. So I've just collected some. I'm gonna test just to see how dark I've gotten. And then I can go back to my number 4 value and continue shading that in, being aware of how dark it is when I first start so that I don't accidentally add a bunch of streaks here. And I'm just going through and adding in that medium tone value, starting out lighter than I think I'm going to need to, because we can always go back and add another layer. So looking at this, it's probably a shade too light. So I'm going to just grab some more from my number 10, bring that down, and I can press a little bit harder with my blending stump just to try to match that value a little bit better. So this is a great way to make a nice light, smooth value. Oftentimes when people try to work with their pencils for the lightest values, it leaves a lot of little lines in that space. So this is a great way to avoid that. Now I'm going to do the same thing with value number 3, just going through, trying to match that value that's directly next to it, keeping this nice and light using circular motions. And if I start to get a little bit lighter, I can always reload the graphite onto my blending stump by going up to the top and grabbing just a little bit more from number 10. So as this starts to get closer, we'll just continue down, and you'll notice it does take a little bit less time as you start to get to these last values. And it just goes pretty quickly because you don't have to add a whole lot and there's not very much to smooth out. And we're going to just fill in number 2. I might be able to add a little bit more graphite. And our very last value that we're going to fill in with a shade is 1. So we're going to just barely touch number 1, and essentially we're leaving 0 as our white. Although it isn't perfectly white on your value scale because of the way that it printed for some reason, that is going to stay white. So we'll just kind of pretend that it's white in our example. So we're just going through and adding this super light layer for number 1, And now we have completed our step value scale. So as you can see, everything is nice and smooth. And once you're finished, if you do have any little blemishes like this that are coming out of the page, or if you've done any testers, I would like for you to go through and erase those to keep it nice and neat. So this is what it should look like, making sure you don't leave any little corners that are unfilled, making sure that you have separate values for all 10 of your values, leaving number 0 as white. So to recap, for our step value scale, we started off with our 6B pencil to fill in 10 through 8 is 6B. Then we moved on to our HB pencil, which we did values 7 through 5. Then we moved on to our blending stump for values 4 through 1. So now we're going to move on to our slide value scale. So we've got a step value scale and a slide value scale, and the only thing that's different is that we are not provided the lines for the boxes, but the steps that we're completing, the way that we're filling this in is almost exactly the same. So again, we're going to start with our 6B pencil, and I like to fill in my value as if I were working with a step value scale in every area that I draw. So even if I'm like filling in an actual drawing of something, say we were working on our gourds, I would fill in every single area that is fading in the exact same way that I filled in my step value scale. So I'm going to start with my darkest value, making sure that it's varnished. So once it's shiny and you've got your darkest value for number 10 filled in, we're going to be transitioning to our 9th value, which means that we are just going to start by pressing a little bit lighter than we were for our 9th value. So what we're doing here is just a little bit different in the way that I'm starting right up against that edge. So I'm coloring right over that line, and I'm trying to make it a nice way to cover it up. So we don't want to see the lines in between our values. However, we do want to separate them out and think about our differences in pressure the way that we did for our step value. So I noticed that I need to sharpen my pencil, which is pretty common after filling in a number 10 value, because otherwise you start to get a lot of blemishes. So I'm working on filling this in, and I can even compare to what I did for my step value scale, just to make sure that I'm not going too light too quickly. I'm just going through and adding some small circles and trying to make sure I don't have any spaces that are left too light. So I'm just going through and filling in this value. And looking at it, I think I might be getting a little bit too light too quickly, but again, that's a better option than to go too dark too quickly. So I'm actually going to just kind of leave it a little bit too light in hopes that if I need to go back through, I can just add another layer rather than having to restart. So now you can see the two values that I've added, and I tried to end it just about at the same place where my number 9 value ended on this side. And so I'm going to begin working on my 8th value by going up against this edge first. So I'm just going to start pressing a little bit lighter, and I'm overlapping that line to make sure that I don't have any lines present. But I am trying to adjust this value to make it a little bit lighter than what is above it. I'd say one of the biggest mistakes that students make is fading too quickly on their sliding value scale, because it is tricky to make sure that you're not getting too light too fast, because we have such an extended amount of space to fill in. So I'm really just paying attention to this value and even to what's next to my value scale here to help me make sure I'm fading at the correct rate. So now I've gotten all the way down to the end of my 8th value scale. You can see that it is a little bit lighter, but I'm okay with that. I'd rather be on the lighter side with this sliding scale. So now that we've done the first 3 values with our 6B pencil, we are going to switch to do our values 7 through 5 with our HB pencil. So again, to begin this, I'm going to just go over the top of this line while pressing a little bit lighter so that I can help these values start to blend together, although we do still want to be focusing on creating 10 separate values. So I'm going to go through and I'm just making small circular motions, thinking about the fact that this same value needs to go all the way till about halfway through the 7 and the 6. So this is what my 7 looks like, and I tried to make it about the same value as the 7 that was directly across from it, and so that it matches on our sliding scale example next to it. So to begin my value 6, I'm going to again just overlap this line, and I'm pressing a little bit lighter than what I was doing for my value number 7. So I'm trying to have a nice smooth transition, and I'm still focused on keeping this a little bit lighter than the value that came before it. We want these to be separate values. Now I've completed value number 6, and you can see it's just a very subtle difference between value number 7 and value number 6. So again, we're starting the same way, overlapping that line first so that we can help these values start to blend together a little bit. And then we're going to just use small circular motions to fill in our next value. And remember that this is the last value that we'll be completing with a pencil before we move on to the blending stump. And you may notice as you start this value that it does start to get a little bit tricky to fill in a value that's this light without leaving pencil lines. So I'm barely touching my paper while trying to fill in this 5th value, because it really does it doesn't require as much pressure, and you'll notice that it leaves a bit more graphite than you might expect. So we're just pressing super lightly for this 5th value. Now that I have my 5th value done, something that will be very helpful when you're working specifically with a sliding value scale, or essentially any scale, any shading area that isn't already broken down for you, that to help something blend from a medium tone to the next tone nice and smoothly, before you add your blending stump technique, before you go over this and try to create your 4th value with our blending stump, I do think it's beneficial to help this fade to white on its own, just the best that you can. So I'm just adding really light little circles here, and I'm just changing my value to get lighter and lighter as we continue down. So I'm just adjusting my pressure here to help this transition out to white, just so that I don't have an abrupt edge there, because since this is a sliding value scale, our transitions are very important. And so I just went through and helped that edge start to disappear. So if you see an abrupt line or an edge where your value ends, it's going to make it trickier for this next step. So go back over it and start adding just a transition section where it fades all the way out to white the best that you can. So remember that for our 4th value all the way to our 1st value, we're working specifically with our blending stump, but we need to load our blending stump with graphite the way that you would load a paintbrush with paint. So I'm going to begin with our 4th value, because we always start by shading these things in on our lighter side. So I'm going to first just test and see how much graphite I have on my blending stump off to the side. And it turns out I don't have very much, which is great. If you do have a lot of graphite, try to remove quite a bit of it off on the side of your scale so that you don't end up going too dark too quickly, since this is our lighter side. So I'm going to start with value number 4. And I'm kind of pulling down some of the value that we just added to help it transition out to white. And I know that this is a bit lighter than what we're going to need, but it's best to have a transition that's fading out to white before we work our way up all the way through to value 10. So we're going to start at 4, fade it out to white, and then we're really focused on making these values match, because looking at this I can see value number 4 is quite a bit different from side to side. So our goal here is just to start with it fading to white, and then once we begin on value number 5, we're really trying to make it match the value directly across from it. So I'm going to just use the side of my blending stump, not just the tip of the blending stump, because that can really flatten them and make them not as effective. So I'm using the side of my blending stump, trying to help this value match the number 5. Something that you can do is, if you feel like it's a little bit too light, you're always welcome to go back through with a light layer of pencil and kind of fill in any areas that might need another layer as you're working. So you can just kind of blend those back into it just to help those match. Now that I've helped 5 match, I'm gonna go through and just consider, first of all, that I want this to be a nice smooth transition. So I'm helping this blend into value number 6, and once I've kind of gotten rid of that line, I'm really focused on taking this section and making that value match the number 6 that's across from it. So I'm applying a bit more pressure on my blending stump, because remember, working with a blending stump is similar to working with a pencil in the way that you can help things get darker by applying a little bit more pressure. So now I'm going to work my way up to value number 7. And again, I'm using the side of my blending stump. And then I'm working my way up to 8. And I noticed that I do fade a little bit too lightly. I think I might need a bit more value because I'm on the lighter side, which is totally fine, because that just means I need to come back through with a little bit more. So I can choose to either load my blending stump up with a little bit more from the top, from number 10, so I can kind of take a little bit of that and kind of pull it downwards to help these values get a bit darker. Or I can take my pencil and add another layer. So if I wanted to go back through with 6B, especially up against these edges, or trying to just make some of these values a little bit darker in their transitions, I can take my actual pencil itself, add another quick light layer over the top of those specific areas, and then continue blending. So now that I've got the majority of these values matching, and I'm going to go through just using my fingers to double check and make sure that they're all accurate, I'm going to start again at number 5, and now I'm really focused on making number 4 match what's across from it. So now that I've got a bit more of the graphite loaded onto my blending stump, I'm able to darken this up a bit more than I was when I first began. So I'm darkening up number 4, and now we're moving down to adding number 3. And I'm just adjusting my pressure to make it a little bit lighter. Now I do notice that I've got a bit of a dark spot. I think that might have been just from me going a little bit too dark there. So I'm going to choose to erase that at this point. Let me show you how to do that. In your kit, you'll have 2 different types of erasers. You'll have just a regular, thicker, solid eraser, and then you'll have what's called a kneaded eraser, which is the kind that you can kind of stretch out and make a little bit softer like this. So if we're trying to erase something and not leave abrupt edges, you want to go with the kneaded eraser compared to wanting like a solid edge to be erased, where you would do the solid eraser. So if we're trying to erase something like this, it's good to just sort of like tap along that space to help remove something without leaving abrupt lines. And then that way we can go back over the top of it with our blending stump and fill it in so that it's nice and smooth. Now we're going to continue fading out to number 2. And fading out to number 1, which is our last value. Now I noticed that my blending stump is starting to run out of graphite, so I might just come back up here for a little while, kind of pull some of that value down. So I'm loading up my blending stump essentially, and just kind of pulling that value down so that I can make these values still have at least a little bit of graphite show up. So I'm going all the way to 1, and then we want to fade out to white for our 0. So I'm just gonna still continue to darken this up a bit, kind of come up to the top so that I can grab a little bit more graphite, work to fill in any little lighter patches to make sure it's a nice smooth transition. And again, I'm working to just bring these darker values down into value number 1 before it fades out to white. Once you're finished with both your step scale and your slide scale, the things that you need to be checking for before you decide that you're finished are, first, do you have 10 separate values and then a 0 for your white? If some of your values look the same, that's something that you'll get marked down for your grade for this portion. So make sure that you do have 10 separate values. The second thing I'm looking for is the texture of your shading. So first of all, I need to be able to tell you used a blending stump all the way through. So if you have any like grainy textures that's left over from working with your pencil on top of the texture of this piece of paper, that's something that you'll get brought down for as well. If I can see any of your lines, that's another reason why your texture grade would get brought down. So you're really going for a smooth texture, no lines, no grainy texture from your pencil, no blemishes. And your second goal is to make sure that you have 10 separate values. So we'll really be comparing to the value scales on the side to make sure that you've done that accurately. So make sure you have done this correctly before you move on, because this is a step that helps you build skills before you're expected to do the more challenging portions of this project. So making sure you've mastered this first is really important. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope that it was helpful for you to have a very in-depth explanation of how to create value scales, how to understand the difference between all 10 values, learning how to work with a blending stump, learning the differences between the types of drawing pencils. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.